What if one private decision from King Charles was enough to leave the entire royal family asking the same question? What happens now? For years, the public has watched the British monarchy evolve through changing generations, changing responsibilities, and moments that have tested the family in ways the world could never fully see. But according to the dramatic scenario behind today's story, King Charles has reportedly made an unexpected family decision, one that could force several senior royals to reconsider what they thought the future would look like. And the biggest question is not simply what Charles decided. The real question is why he decided to do it now. So before we go any further, make sure you subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay with us until the end, because the final part of this story could completely change the way you see the decision at the center of this royal mystery. For a moment, imagine the atmosphere inside the palace when the news first emerged. There is no dramatic announcement to the public, no warning, no obvious sign that anything unusual is about to happen. The royal household continues with its normal schedule. Meetings are arranged, briefings are prepared, staff members move from one responsibility to another, public engagements continue as planned. From the outside, everything appears completely ordinary, but behind closed doors, a decision has reportedly been made that could affect the balance of responsibilities within the family. And according to this speculative scenario, even some members of the royal household were not expecting it. That is what makes the story so compelling. A decision made by the monarch is never simply a private family matter. Every choice involving senior royals can carry institutional consequences. A change in responsibility can affect public appearances, charitable work, ceremonial duties, future planning, and the way different members of the family are perceived. Even a decision that begins as a private conversation can eventually become something much larger. And if Charles truly wanted to change something significant within the family, the question would immediately become, who knew about it first? Was William informed? Was Catherine informed? Were other senior members of the family consulted? Or did Charles make the decision himself before revealing it? Those questions are at the heart of this story. Now, it is important to make something clear. There is no verified evidence establishing that King Charles has made the specific dramatic decision described in this scenario. This is a storytelling concept built around royal intrigue, not a claim that an actual secret announcement has been confirmed. Real royal decisions should be checked against credible official or news sources. But for the purpose of this story, imagine that the decision is real, and that the first people to hear about it are not journalists, but the people closest to the king. The reaction inside the palace would likely be immediate, not necessarily because everyone disagreed. Sometimes the most shocking decisions are the ones nobody expected to happen so soon. Imagine Charles calling for a private discussion. No cameras, no press release, no audience. Just a small number of people in the room. The king speaks. The decision is revealed. And for several seconds, nobody says anything. Why? Because the decision changes expectations. Someone may have believed that a particular royal would continue in a certain role for years. Someone else may have expected a gradual transition. Another person may have assumed that Charles would wait before making any major changes. But suddenly, the timeline has changed. And when a timeline changes inside a royal family, everyone has to adjust. That is where the tension begins. What could have convinced Charles to make such a decision? Was it simply part of a long-term plan? Was he preparing the monarchy for the next generation? Was he responding to changing circumstances? Or did something happen behind the scenes that forced him to act sooner than expected? Those questions may be impossible to answer immediately, but there is one detail that would make the decision particularly significant. Timing. Why now? That is the question viewers would naturally ask. A monarch can make plans for years before the public ever hears about them. Changes in royal duties can be discussed months in advance. Family responsibilities can be adjusted gradually. So when a decision appears to happen suddenly, people naturally wonder whether there was a trigger. Perhaps Charles had been considering the move for some time, Perhaps advisors had recommended it. Perhaps another royal had requested a change. Or perhaps the king believed that the monarchy needed to send a new message. Whatever the reason, the decision would represent more than a simple change. It could signal a new direction. And that is where William's position becomes particularly interesting. As heir to the throne, William's future is closely connected to the long-term structure of the monarchy. Any major decision involving senior royal responsibilities could eventually affect him. Even if Charles's decision had nothing directly to do with William, the prince would still have to understand what it meant for the institution he is expected to lead one day. Imagine William receiving the news privately. Would he immediately support his father's decision? Would he ask questions? Would he wonder why he had not been consulted? Or would he understand that Charles had made a decision based on information the public, and perhaps even other family members, did not have? The answer would depend entirely on what the decision actually involved. And that is the mystery, because the title promises an unexpected decision. But the audience does not yet know what that decision is. That information gap is what creates suspense. A royal story becomes powerful when the audience knows something has changed but does not yet understand why. And according to this fictional scenario, something has changed. The palace atmosphere is different. The family is being asked to adjust, and Charles appears determined to move forward. But there may be another reason this decision is causing concern. What if the change affects more than one person? What if it changes the responsibilities of several members of the family at the same time? That would make the decision much more significant. Imagine a private royal structure that has been carefully maintained for years suddenly being reorganized. One person receives more responsibility. Another person loses a role. Someone else is asked to step forward. And someone who expected to remain in the background is suddenly placed under a much brighter spotlight. That kind of change could create excitement. It could also create tension. Because responsibility inside a royal family is not only about titles, it is about expectations, public scrutiny, travel, ceremonial duties, charities, military connections, state occasions, and the constant pressure of representing the monarchy. A change in one area can therefore affect everything else. This is why Charles's decision, if it were real, would deserve careful attention. But there is another question. Did Charles make the decision because he believed the monarchy needed to change? That possibility could be the most important of all. The modern monarchy operates in a very different environment from previous generations. Public expectations are changing. Younger generations expect different forms of communication. Social media has transformed how royal appearances are interpreted. The public can react instantly to almost anything a senior royal says or does. Charles understands that environment, and if he believed the monarchy needed to adapt, a family decision could be part of a much larger strategy. Perhaps he was thinking about the next decade. Perhaps he was thinking about William's eventual reign. Perhaps he was considering how responsibilities should be distributed between generations. Or perhaps the decision was much more personal. That is where the story becomes difficult to predict, because a family decision can have both institutional and emotional consequences. The people involved are not simply public figures. They are family members. And even when the monarchy is the subject, personal feelings can never be completely separated from public responsibilities. Imagine the private conversation after Charles announces his decision. Someone asks, "Why now?" Charles gives an answer. But is that answer enough? Perhaps one person remains silent. Perhaps another asks whether the decision is permanent. Perhaps someone wants to know how the public will be told. And perhaps Charles makes it clear that the decision is final. That single word, final, could change the atmosphere completely. Because once a monarch makes a decision, reversing it can be difficult. The palace would then need to prepare. Advisors would need to consider the wording. Officials would need to coordinate schedules. Communications teams would need to think about public reaction. And family members would need to understand what their new responsibilities could mean. All of that could happen before the public even knows anything has changed. That is why royal announcements can sometimes appear sudden when, behind the scenes, they have been carefully prepared. But what if this decision really was unexpected? What if even the people closest to Charles were surprised? Then the story becomes much more intriguing, because someone may have to ask the king why he chose this moment, and the answer could reveal something about what he believes the monarchy needs next. Could this be about William? Could it be about the future of the institution? Could it be about reducing pressure on certain members of the family? Could it be about preparing a younger generation to take on greater responsibilities? Or could there be a completely different reason? We do not know. And that uncertainty is what will carry us into the next part of this story. Because the decision itself is only the beginning. The real drama begins when the other members of the royal family learn what Charles has decided. How did they react? Who supported him? Who questioned the decision? And was there one family member whose reaction was completely different from what Charles expected? That is the question we need to explore next. Because a king's decision can be made in one room, but its consequences can reach every corner of the royal family. And if Charles truly believed this was the right moment to make a major change, then he must have had a reason. Perhaps that reason has been carefully hidden from public view. Perhaps it is connected to the future of the monarchy. Or perhaps the explanation is much simpler than the rumors suggest. Either way, the next stage of the story could reveal why this decision has created so much curiosity. So, what do you think? If King Charles suddenly made a major family decision without giving everyone advance warning, would you expect William to support him immediately? Or would he demand an explanation first? Leave your opinion in the comments. The decision had been made, but the real test was only beginning. A monarch can make a decision behind closed doors, but once that decision affects other members of the royal family, the reaction can become just as important as the announcement itself. And according to the dramatic scenario we are exploring, this was exactly what happened after King Charles revealed his unexpected family decision. The palace atmosphere reportedly changed almost immediately. There was no public confrontation, no dramatic statement, and no obvious sign of conflict. But behind the carefully controlled walls of the royal household, questions began to emerge. What exactly had Charles decided? Why had he chosen this moment? And most importantly, why did some members of the family apparently need time to process the news? Before we go deeper, remember that this is a speculative royal drama scenario rather than a verified report of an actual secret decision by King Charles. The purpose is to explore a fictionalized possibility while keeping the difference between storytelling and confirmed royal news clear. With that said, imagine the moment when the news finally reaches the senior members of the family. One message changes the atmosphere. A conversation that was expected to be routine suddenly becomes something else entirely. Advisors begin making calls. Schedules are checked. People start asking what the announcement means. And somewhere in the middle of all of it is Prince William, the future king, trying to understand exactly what his father has decided. William's reaction would be especially important because any major change inside the monarchy inevitably touches the future. Charles is king today, but William represents the next generation. The decisions made during Charles's reign can shape the institution William may eventually inherit. That means William would have every reason to understand the reasoning behind a major change, even if he did not personally make the decision. Would he immediately agree with his father? Perhaps. Charles and William may have different perspectives, but they share an interest in maintaining the stability of the monarchy. If Charles believed the decision was necessary, William might recognize the long-term reasoning behind it. But what if William had not expected the decision? That is where the tension in this scenario begins. Imagine William receiving the news privately. He listens carefully. He does not react dramatically. He asks a few questions. How long had the decision been under consideration? Who else knew? Was the decision permanent? Had the necessary advisors already been consulted? And perhaps the most important question of all, what happens next? Those questions would not necessarily indicate disagreement. They could simply indicate responsibility. A future monarch would need to understand the consequences of any major change within the royal structure. William could support the decision while still wanting to know exactly how it would affect the family. And yet, according to the dramatic storyline, there was something about the announcement that made the situation more complicated. The decision had consequences. Someone's role would change. Someone's responsibilities would shift. And perhaps someone would have to step into a position they had not expected to occupy so soon. That possibility would naturally create uncertainty. Imagine being told that your future responsibilities have suddenly changed. Even if the change is positive, it can be overwhelming. Royal duties are not ordinary jobs. They involve constant public attention, official events, charitable organizations, international travel, ceremonial responsibilities, and intense scrutiny from the media. A change in responsibility can therefore affect a person's entire routine. Now imagine that change being announced by the king. Would everyone simply accept it? Probably not immediately. There would be questions, there might be concerns, and there would certainly be conversations. But perhaps the most fascinating reaction would come from someone who was not expected to be at the center of the story. A senior royal who had remained relatively quiet. Someone whose role had been changing gradually. Someone who suddenly realized that Charles's decision could affect their own position. Who could that be? That is one of the questions the scenario deliberately leaves open. Because the more people are affected by a decision, the more complicated the consequences become. And this is where the royal family would have to balance two different realities. The first is personal. Family members have feelings, expectations, and relationships. The second is institutional. The monarchy requires structure, continuity, and clear responsibilities. Charles, as king, would have to consider both. Perhaps that is why the decision was made privately before being communicated more widely. A sensitive change could not simply be announced without preparation. The family would need time to understand it. Advisors would need to anticipate questions. Public communications would need to be carefully considered. But if the decision was truly unexpected, the preparation may not have been as complete as everyone would have liked. That could explain the whispers, the private conversations, the unanswered questions, and the growing curiosity about what Charles had in mind. Now consider another possibility. What if the decision was not about removing someone from a role, but about giving someone a much larger responsibility? That would create a completely different kind of tension. Being given more responsibility sounds positive, but it can also create pressure. A senior royal stepping into a larger role would become more visible. Every speech would receive greater attention. Every mistake would be analyzed. Every appearance would become part of the public conversation. If Charles believed the monarchy needed a stronger presence from the next generation, perhaps his decision was designed to accelerate that transition. And if so, William would be central to the strategy. The future of the monarchy would not simply be about titles. It would be about preparing people for what comes next. That could explain why Charles might make a decision that appears sudden to the public but is actually part of a longer plan. Perhaps he has been watching how different members of the family handle responsibility. Perhaps he has been evaluating public reactions. Perhaps he has been considering how the monarchy can remain relevant while maintaining its traditions. And perhaps the unexpected decision was the first visible sign of a much larger transition. But there is another possibility that makes the story even more dramatic. What if William did not agree with the timing? Again, disagreement does not have to mean conflict. William could understand the decision while believing that it should happen later. He could support the long-term goal but question the immediate consequences. He could ask whether the public was ready, or he could simply want more time to prepare. Imagine that private conversation. Charles explains his reasoning. William listens. Then William asks a simple question. Why now? That question could be the most important moment in the entire story. Because if Charles had been planning the change for a long time, he would have an answer. Perhaps the answer was that the monarchy could not afford to wait. Perhaps circumstances had changed. Perhaps the king believed that delaying the decision would create even greater problems later. Or perhaps he simply believed that the time had come. Whatever the answer, William would have to decide how to respond. Would he challenge his father? Would he accept the decision? Would he ask for modifications?